is Heather Hughes. I am the Trust Lead Professional for Humanities, and we are going to this afternoon be looking at how we can make homework within geography a meaningful experience, both for our students and for our staff. Okay, so our first point, before we go any further, is for us to have a think about this question here. And it might be you want to press pause on this video. Why is it that we set homework? Is it because it's school policy? Is it because, well, that's just what we do in our school, we set homework? Or is it because it's a genuinely integrated part of our curriculum, that it fits in just as, you know, a lesson would, that it is a fully integrated part of our studies? So that's what I'd like you to do first, is genuinely have a think, why are we setting homework? Often homework can be, you know, it can create problems. Students might not finish it. They don't finish it to the standard that you wanted them to. You might think it's more additional work that my staff have to do because we have to mark it. So then why are we setting it? What do we get out of it? And more importantly, what do our students get out of it? Well, the EEF reckon this is what we get out of it. On average, around 5 months progress has been documented to be the result of homework being set. Now, we have to take into account that the few disclaimers. Some of the studies that the EEF undertook were quite small, and obviously there is a wide variation in what they call the potential impact. So we do sort of have to take it, not with a pinch of salt, but we have to bear all of that in mind. But there does appear evidence that when homework is set, students make progress. And that's really going to be our driver, isn't it, if we're setting homework? Another area when we're looking at homework, more generically, rather than just with geography, is the issue of our disadvantaged students. Now, if we start with what Cooper, Robinson and Patel came out with some research they did back in 2006, they came out with this quote, okay, this idea that the relationship between how much homework our students do and their overall achievements, their outcomes, is a positive one and is statistically significant. Now, we could say as classroom practitioners, well, that's not a surprise, because when our students do homework, the types of students that do get involved in their homework, that do use their initiative, that do try hard, that do show care, well, they're going to show that in the classroom anyway, and they're going to show that with their preparation for an assessment, and eventually they'll show that with their preparation for their final exams. So we do have to sort of take that into account. But if that is the case, that when homework, that 5 months progress that the EEF talk about, if there is some link between homework being completed by students, and we'll look a bit later at how we can get them to buy into it, and their overall outcomes, then surely it's, you know, it's something we've got to really take into account, particularly for our disadvantaged students, that in some cases the data tends to show that they can underperform for whatever reasons. Surveys within England have obviously put forward the key issue, and the key issue is that pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds are going to find it more difficult perhaps to complete homeworks than other students, less likely to have some quiet area that they can study in, less likely to have access to perhaps a device that's suitable for learning. So that has to be taken into account. Their internet connection is less stable, or they're just relying on a phone because they haven't got internet specifically to the house. They might not have the parental support that perhaps other students might have. All of these sort of, you know, sort of swimming around our disadvantaged students, and then we're expecting them to do work at home. and therefore all that homework is actually doing is it's creating that gap, and that our disadvantaged students are not making that rise up as perhaps everyone else is. So we need to think about as well, when we're setting homework, is it accessible? And also perhaps thinking about, well, if they can't do it at home, do I work in a school where there is an alternative for those sorts of students? There is somewhere that's a pleasant place for them to be working in, whether it's the library, whether it's something that the school runs, but it is something that we do need to take into account. Now, again, going back to the EF, they put some stuff together, I was going to say last year, but now 2021, and they talked about the active ingredients to the approach of setting homework. One thing that would help all students, including our disadvantaged students, is the quality. It's not necessarily setting lots and lots and lots and lots of homework or expecting them to do, huge amounts of writing or what have you, but it's the quality. Because if the quality's there, then all the students are going to benefit. And if the students from disadvantaged backgrounds do find homework difficult for whatever reasons, for the environment that they are, within, then let's make it quality for them. Link it to classroom learning so that perhaps they're not reliant, our students are not just reliant on clicking onto the internet. And again, it helps our disadvantaged students. Making sure you share with your pupils, with your students, the aims of the homework. Why are you doing it? Why am I expecting you, my class, to be buying into this? Now, we could say, well, we set it as teachers, they should be doing it. Well, let's explain to them how it helps them in their learning, okay? Taking into account when you set homework, those barriers, access to learning devices, access to the internet, access to quiet time, try to be sensitive to those students that live in that world. We can still set homework, we've just got to think a little bit more carefully that it's not over reliant on perhaps the technology. Are we teaching them explicitly how to learn independently? We give them a task as a homework, we pack them off at the end of the lesson, and we expect them to bring back the quality goods as the completed work. But have you put in place, established very clearly strategies so they know how to work on their own? I know, working with students that are perhaps a little bit more needy, whether it's COVID, who knows, but would it be right then I set this homework and don't set out some sort of strategies on, you're going to be sat on your own, you may well not have anyone around you helping you. Again, if you go back to the information above the bullet points, if we've got students in homes where they can't always rely on their parents, their carers for that help to complete the homework, then are we putting into our students the ability to independently learn? How are we providing feedback? I think that's quite important. You'll hear students grumble sometimes that, oh, the teacher set me a homework, but they never bothered to look at it. Well, it does seem a little bit odd if it's so important to set them and they're doing it at home on their own, so no one's been able to look at it, and then they're bringing it in on an agreed deadline and it's not looked at, you don't give feedback. That doesn't mean you've got to give written feedback. If we're talking about workload issues, it might well be that you're moving around that classroom anyway during a lesson and you get the chance then to look at their homework, and it might be verbal feedback, but the students understand that I did it, the teachers looked at it, they've given me some feedback about it. There is a value to this process. And then finally, as well, obviously the key bit is looking at pupil engagement. Have they done it well, or have they done it so they're not going to get into trouble with you? And I think that's always, you know, something that as teachers we need to be looking at. And a lot of the time children will do enough, but you know, if they were in the classroom and they were doing that activity, you would be driving them on, you'd be sort of asking them questions to enhance the answer that they finally give you. Again, it's sort of going back to this independent learning strategies. Are the students and their homework giving you that same quality as they would if they were sat in front of you in your classroom? The GA put together some materials on why they felt homework should be or is being set. And they looked at a couple of key areas. One was to finish off work, and one was to extend learning and understanding. I know I've in the past set homeworks to finish off something. And I'm not saying that that's wrong at all. But what you do have to think about are those bullet points in the right-hand column. So does the work really need to be finished? And if it does, are you sending your students away being able to access suitable resources, bearing in mind what we've just said about disadvantaged students? Okay. Can the students do it without teacher support? If they're doing something with you in the classroom and then you say, right, can you finish this off at home? Can they? Or is it something where they would still need to be within a classroom setting? The work that you've set that you're expecting them to finish off at home, is it going to challenge all of those students? Because in a classroom, we can set a task and we can challenge students individually by moving around and focusing on a child and saying, yeah, but why have you put that? Go on, put yourself a little bit more with your answer. Do you think two ideas there is enough? Well, you're not going to be present, are you, for the remainder of that work? So how are you going to get that challenge within there? And the differentiation, this idea of personalising it. With the idea about extending, perhaps it might be adding to a case study that you've started in the class. It talks there about, for example, students may have compiled a case study during a lesson time and be asked to investigate or expand upon a certain aspect, e.g. What could have been done to prepare future flooding in Mozambique since the floods of 2000. Now, you might be lucky and it might be that there happens to be something on television that they could watch, or there's something that could be they could access sort of that way. It might be that you've got materials that they can take home. But again, looking at these bullet points, it's going that bit further. If you're going to extend their learning, if you want them to add to something, are you giving them a structure? Are there guidelines? You know, is there a success criteria? Do they know what you want? We slip sometimes, not just homework, but perhaps with classwork as well. We slip into this, and I do this sometimes, is in my head, I can see the piece of work that's finished. I see what it is I want them to do. But what I would be asking myself is, and you might be asking yourselves is that image in your head the same one that's in your students' heads? Can they see what you want? So, sometimes we call it modelling or giving an exemplar or however, but it's the same with homework. If you want them to do that extension work to develop their understanding, do you think it's worth perhaps, I don't know, keeping some? It might be one of your colleagues has already done this homework and they had some in and some were great and they've either photocopied them or they've still got them, and you show it. So this is what I want. This is a standard. And can you see how they've set it out? Can you see what they did there in that box or whatever it is? Can you see how they use that source to help explain about the prevention and the preparation that's going on with flood? sort of the flood problems in Mozambique. And again, this idea about, are you expecting them all to do the same thing? Or are you going to tailor it to the abilities that are sat in front of you, the abilities that are walking home and going to be completing that particular piece of homework? And that last bullet point, when I started talking to you, not at you. When I started talking at the start, this idea about integration. What are the outcomes going to be of the task that the students have done at home? How will it be fed into their classwork? Does it need to be? And that's a genuine question. Does it need to be fed in? If it is fed in, it will make more sense to the students why you ask them to do it. And they will understand the thought process, you would hope, from you as the teacher. So just some ideas there from the GA. Now, going on, the GA then looked at, well, okay, are we using homework to apply our learning? So it's almost a learning check in a way. Are you going to, you've taught them some map skills, you've been very thorough in the lesson. Now they're going to take that and they're going to use it. Now you have to make sure, obviously, if that's the case, before all those children leave, have you put something within the lesson to allow you to check that they're leaving with those skills? If they got that knowledge, because if they haven't, that student's going to come back in either with work that's not great, or it's incomplete, or even a bit of resentment. How was I supposed to do that? I didn't have all the knowledge. You know, why did he or she set me that? That wasn't fair. So this idea about application, gathering data, research, this idea that the students have to go away and collect information. Well, this is where you have to think very, very carefully, and you have to be very sensitive to the students you've got. Can they all access the relevant information? It can't be over reliant necessarily on technology being accessed at home. If the students are working in groups, how is that going to work outside of the classroom? And also, the joy of group work. How are you going to be able to work out who's done what? We all know that when group work happens, there can be sometimes the issue of a student who is just cruising along, either copying what the other group members are doing, or actually just not even bothering. And then finally, this idea about homework being used to review or to consolidate. Revision, which is a classic, isn't it? We set revision homework for them. You've got your assessment next week or whatever. Preparation for external exams, so the big exams, as I, that you've got coming up, as I would say. And it can be for prepping. It can be they've got their test next week. It could be that you're using a homework to identify gaps before the assessment's going to be coming along. So the assessment isn't next week. Okay, the assessment's 2-3 weeks away, 4 weeks away. What you're going to do in between then is, yes, they might be doing some form of revision, but actually what it's all about is identifying gaps so that those gaps can be filled before the assessment. So, the homework's actually being used to diagnose and hopefully to cure. Okay. All of this information has come from the GA's handbook back in 2006, but I think it's still very much the case for today. So if that's what the GA are talking about, here's what the EEF have to say. Effective homework. Link it to classroom work. it makes it more effective. Students can perhaps understand the need for it a lot more. They also went on and said that when there is feedback on homework, you get a higher impact on learning. Now, again, how that feedback is undertaken, that's something that you would have to sort of consider. And I guess it depends on the type of homework that's been set. Making sure the students understand why they're doing it. Okay. I think a lot of our students see homework as punishment, or just something that evil teachers set. And actually that's not the case. But unless you tell them, a 12, a 13, a 14, a 15-year-old is just going to look at you and go, oh. So explain it to them. Like, this is why I'm setting it. This is how it's going to help you. This is what it means next lesson. This is what it's going to mean for our assessment. This is my thinking, that it is helpful to you, that it is beneficial to you, that it makes you a better student in geography. Again, we touched on this earlier. Quality of the task set appears to be more important than the quantity. And that appears to be more is to the pupil, is to the student, so that they get this idea that it's got to be really good. Okay, it's almost like the teacher is there in the room when I'm doing my homework, and is expecting, is demanding, is looking and saying, well, you need to add 2 more ideas there. What, you haven't explained it there, or where's your source? What are you going to be doing? Have you used your map skills as in as much detail as you can? That sort of level we want in the mindset of the children, and then it's shown in the quality of their work, rather than lots and lots of paper, lots and lots of lists, but actually the quality is not there. Interesting bit of evidence here. The impact of homework actually goes down as the amount of time pupils spend on it goes up. So think carefully about how much time you think students, if they're genuinely trying, are going to be spending on that task that you've set. Because as it goes on and on and on, the quality of it will reduce. Studies review that the highest impacts set homework twice a week. Now, that might not be possible in your school. It might be that you follow a homework timetable. So you might look at it and go, well, we can't do that, Heather. That's just not going to happen. And that's fine. If you do have greater freedom, it doesn't mean that both homeworks are going to be the same amount. Okay. So it's, again, it's something that I guess is very dependent on your school. Now, what the GA have said about effective homework, because that was the EEF, the GA talk about it would need to tick the following boxes. Very much about developmental issues, so developing the students' knowledge and their skills. Again, here we go, relating to the learning in the unit currently being studied, so linking into the lessons, and there we go, linked into class activity. Being challenging, but not too. So it's challenging in that students are going to have a bit of a think. So it's not easy. And therefore, if it's so easy, the students are just going to, well, why are you asking me to do this? This is, simple. But it's not too hard that they're sat there going, I can't do this, I can't do this. And again, that links back to our disadvantaged students who might not have as much support from home. It might be that other students who do get support from the carers and parents, they can wander into the kitchen with their geography homework and say, I don't get this, would you help me? And there'll be a mum and a dad or whoever who will sit and go through it with, oh yeah, it's this, this and this. That's not accessible to all our students. So we need to think about challenge. Making sure our students gain from it. Again, this idea about clear purpose. So we see these ideas are being, put forward by more than one organisation. Engaging, how you're going to sell it to the students, and feedback. So there's a lot of overlap between what the GA is saying and what the EEF is saying. So you know, it would seem that there are some genuine points that if you want to make your homework effective, meaningful, that you need to be sort of checking it against what you're currently doing. So here we go, 2 questions. And again, if you want to just press stop for a minute and have a bit of a think. Think about last week, okay? Think about the groups that you taught and think about the homeworks that you've set. So you set your key stage 3s, 4s, maybe 5s, and think, right, okay, so I've got what the GA thinks effective. I've got what the EEF thinks effective. How many of these could I tick off? How many, as I look above in that pink box, could I say genuinely, yes? Okay, yes, I can tick those off for the quality, for the type, for my thinking of homework. And then the second question to have a think about is, think about a unit of work, part of the curriculum, a scheme of learning, whatever you want to call it, that you've planned, that you've been responsible for. It might not have been taught yet. And think about where homework appears in it. And hopefully it appears in a very specific fashion. And again, use those boxes, that tick list almost, to check it against. And see on reflection whether or not lots of those boxes can be ticked. And if they can, have a think about, well, why? Why do I know that that will challenge all the students, but they can still do it? You know, is it manageable? Have I produced all the resources to go with that piece of extension research that I would like them to do? You know, so have a think very carefully about how many of those boxes above the questions on the screen at the moment I could genuinely answer, either as a classroom teacher that's produced some of these curriculum units, or as a head department, perhaps reviewing your curriculum. Can I tick those boxes? It'd be quite interesting, I think, for you to sort of have a bit of a reflection point on this. So we're going to look at now a couple of strategies that the holy grail of strategies that require either very little or no written feedback, because obviously feedback's important, we've established that, but we also are aware that our teachers, or us, are all under, you know, quite a heavy workload. So any ways that we can alleviate workload, we're going to seriously have a think about. So the first one is forms quizzes or Google quizzes. Depends on what sort of way that you use your tech. And yes, there is the obvious case that, you know, can all our students access? Now, the one thing about these is they are easy to get on students' phones, so that might make it more straightforward. So the idea is that you can provide students with multiple choice questions and they will assess either the learning intentions from a lesson or the key facts of a lesson. Evidence sort of suggests that you need to aim for around 8 to 12 questions and perhaps 4 to 5 options for each one. I think the second point there about always making one of the options I do not know yet, because one, the phrasing is quite positive. Instead of saying I do not know yet, there's that element where it's not seen as a criticism of the student. And also we know that with multiple choices, and I've done it, you know, sometimes you tick one off and you think, oh, I'll have a guess. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And if you're using these quizzes to help you see where the students are at, that does not help you. Okay. You can add notes and comments to incorrect answer options for instant feedback when students choose the wrong one. So you can already set it up where you think, I know a lot of my students are going to pick that, because they always get it confused with, you know, X and Y. So you can put a note in there, so when they click on it, it pops straight up, oh, you know, this isn't the right one, because again, this aids your workload, because you don't have to say when you're looking at the information, or you're thinking, right, I'm going to have to speak to them about that, I'm going to have to speak to them about that next lesson. You don't have to, because you've already shared with them, you know, an error that they've made. Students will be more likely, because the process is very straightforward, to complete it. A lot of us use these in lockdowns, so some of the students are already sort of quite savvy with it, and some of our staff are quite savvy with it, and that, you know, and it's accessible to them. Depending on whichever one it is, if it's Google, if it's Microsoft, you can track completion really well, you know, and students can get instant feedback. So again, this idea of them getting feedback we mentioned earlier makes homework more effective, and from a workload point of view, you and your staff are having a chance to get some of the work taken off you in a way. And then that final point, you can, looking at the collated evidence of how your students have done, start to see where perhaps you need to take part of your next lesson and consider developing an area where they've shown a weak understanding, or there's a misconception going on, because it's providing you really with whole class sort of marking, isn't it? You've got all your data, and you see, oh, they've all gone wrong there, right, I need to address that before we move on. Or one or two students, or the weaker students, from my own knowledge, I know those are the weaker students, and they've all made the same mistake. I need to take them aside and have a chat with them about that. So forms quizzes are really good at diagnosing, but there is a caveat to these, the howevers. They're very much knowledge based, aren't they? These sorts of activities. So it's great for checking recall, checking knowledge, but it doesn't help you or the students with looking at how they then apply that to exam questions. There is guess, like I said, you have to be careful. You have to take into account that it's not always a true indicator. And also, sometimes it's difficult to come up with questions. You're sort of thinking, oh, how can I make the multiple choices, you know, thoughtful? It's really difficult. There's only one obvious one there, or, you know, so it can be difficult sometimes to come up with those sorts of ideas. Now, another idea, and this is not a new idea, but it is an idea that is always sort of talked about in the background. That's flipped learning. Flipped learning tends to be, from past experience, a technique that's used with our exam students, Key Stage 4, very much for Key Stage 5, and the idea being that the students are introduced to learning materials before the lesson through homework. So they do pre-reading activities, they might have to watch something, and then they come to that lesson with that knowledge already in their heads, and then you get to use that knowledge to get the kids to be applying skills or using it towards an exam question. Obviously, what it does allow us to do is move through content a lot more quickly and to get through a lot more content. There are all sorts of resources out there. Lockdown and COVID certainly aided that. You've got an example there if you want to copy and paste that afterwards. Oak Academy, I know, you know, some people loved it, some people loathed it, but there's a huge amount of resources there, and they're still there, that you can still access. And I guess the other point as well is that the nature of flipped learning means that you are constantly reviewing what they've done at home, so that the feedback is that it is pretty straightforward. You will be giving it verbally. You will be not having to sit and mark stuff. So staff workload isn't necessarily going to have to increase. The students are doing something really meaningful, but the staff aren't having to mark it because the homework wasn't set for that particular reason. But like the online quizzes, we do have to take into account. It can be difficult to establish, what happens if not all the students have completed their flipped learning and then they arrive at your lesson. How are you going to deal with the discrepancies? Some students know what you want them to know, some might not. What happens if a student was absent when you set the flipped learning? And again, they arrive in your lesson, they sit down blank, they don't know what you're on about. So you do have to take that into account. And again, not all our students have access to the same forms of media. So when you are setting this flipped learning homework, are you providing a broad enough range that they can all come with the right information in their heads or, on their sheets or in their books, but they haven't necessarily had to all use the same form of media. I love Twitter. Okay, I'll put my hands up, and I love it for daft pictures, I don't know, dogs on roller skates, but I also love it as a teacher because of the generosity of colleagues across the country. Sharing their ideas, putting links on, sharing their Google Drives. I think it's one of our strengths as a profession. And so what I've got for next couple of slides are basically, as it says there, magpie ideas. So these are just ideas that you can take away from here. You might use them, you might already be using them, but it's just hopefully there for you. One idea that was put forward for retrieval is the idea of how are you alternating homeworks. So if you are someone that uses homework for retrieval purposes, think about how you might want to set it out across a year. So the example there is that 1 week you do exam practice on current learning, the next week it's from prior learning, and it could be odd ones out, it could be you give them a little answer or you give them an answer that you've written and they've got to find and fix all the errors in it. But it's this idea of alternation. So how are you going to alternate over the year so that when the students approach the exam, whether it's a mock or whether it's their finals, that the homework's perhaps kept all that knowledge fresh in their heads. Exam practice, I think homeworks, looking at Twitter and looking at what's out there, homework is very much the domain of exam practice when it comes to Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5. So it might be you've got booklets. I know that increases workload, but obviously once they're made, they're there. So it's just a matter of getting them printed for when you do need them. So short response ones have perhaps a teacher version where there's modelled answers. That could be built into when you're setting your homeworks. Setting exam questions does appear to get student buy-in. Okay, they get the purpose of it. Sometimes our students, so they're simple beasts. You've got an exam. This exam's really important. Before that, we go to do practices. We can't do them all the time in our lessons, so we're going to set them as homework. And they do buy into that. They do get that. And the other thing is, it might well be that as they're working through different questions in their homework, they're aware that perhaps one of those might end up on the end of unit assessment. And so that drives them on as well. Another colleague talked about two-part programmes. So this idea, it can be for GCSE or A-level, that you've got part A is some kind of revision activity. That could be short answers, low stakes, maybe online. Seneca, for example, is used, I know, at our school very much for geography homeworks. Part B then is a practice, and then that's on exam questions. That's on a recent lesson. So you've got revision of previous, and again, this goes into retrieval. You've got exam question on recent. Smaller exam questions, so not going to take students massive amounts of time, but again, it's this idea of getting the kids engaged. It's time effective, it's meaningful. Bigger questions can then be done in the classroom. They don't have to be set as homeworks. Students will probably complete the shorter ones more likely. Reduces, if you want your staff to be marking them, it reduces workload, and it allows them to spend the time on the more complex questions, which I would assume you'd be wanting them to be spending time with students on. Revision, create. One example would be using sort of Cornell type system. So it's much more structured. You might want to have a look online at Cornell. I know it's about making notes, but you can actually use it to create revision guides as well. And again, depending on student access to technology, but you could get the students to photograph completed work and then upload it to Teams. They could share it on OneNote if you're a Microsoft school. But this idea about thinking about workload. Revision guides, whether it's a CPD or if you've got something else, loaning them out to students, and particularly obviously our disadvantaged students, making sure they've got those copies, and each week giving them a sheet with perhaps exam questions on and page references to the revision guide, and they can use a revision guide to help them. But definitely when you've got your exam groups, using some link to exams with homework creates engagement and buy-in, because it's a very black and white, practical, concrete reason to be doing your homework. Seneca, I've already mentioned. There was a lot of talk on Twitter about edpuzzle.com. I had a quick look. It seems quite a nice package. Multiple choice questions throughout. Tasomai, which is another online package, it does cost, but looking at costings, no more than £15 a student. Again, it depends on obviously capitation for you, whether you could sell it to your school as a more whole school point. There's another package that's out there called Educake. That's for low stakes testing. That's picking up a lot of positive praise on Twitter. Subscription is around £550 for Educake. Other areas that you might want to look at is blank summary sheets, and then the students fill them in at home. They might have to add to it, so parts of it are filled in by you, and then they have to fill it in a different colour. Again, they can post photos if you prefer, ping them across onto Teams. It might also be that you get them to, when they're posting them, that it might be they get a chance to look at each other's. So again, it's this idea of supporting each other, and they look at it and think, oh, I didn't, Now we could say, well, that's copying. It's a student just cheating. But we could also say, well, it's already done. And then you perhaps release some of the photos and say, well, what could you add to yours? It's this idea of sort of, letting students learn from each other. Giving students sections from non-fiction books, setting multiple choice questions on it. Another colleague on Twitter looked at setting questions every week based on topics that they'd perhaps not performed very well in, whether it was a mock, whether it was a previous assessment, whether it was a retrieval starter. And again, it's about plugging gaps, isn't it? About using homework to plug those gaps so that when they have their next assessment, the idea would be that they do better. And then finally, alternating between reading activities and encouraging students to read around a topic and providing with the materials. Now, again, That would particularly help our disadvantaged students who might not have access to those sorts of reading materials. It's very much building up cultural capital if you're providing these different reading materials for your students, and then alternating that with your exam question, your more traditional work. Whether the two are linked, that's up to you. But certainly, I think we all know that a lot of our students really don't read enough. And finally, first, go back to the homeworks that you set. Below, there are some questions that the GA have on their website. And what I'd like you to do is decide on how many you could genuinely tick off. But also, think about how often you ask these questions about the homework that you set your classes week on week, and ask these questions about how you plan your homework within your curriculum. And I think these questions are actually really, really quite powerful. Did it fulfill its purpose? Did that homework do what it was supposed to do? And did all the students do it? And if not, to either of those questions, what are you going to do about it? You know, particularly that second point, if the students haven't done it, and there's a lot of them, is it because they're just lazy? They couldn't be bothered? Or is there another reason? The buy-in wasn't there. They couldn't access the materials. So have a think about those first two questions. The second one, did I share the intended objectives of the homework? Now, we're great at sharing objectives to lessons. We'll start the lesson, most of us will share our learning intentions or our learning aims or objectives with our students. By the end of this lesson, you will be able to, I want you to be able to, this is what this is the point, this is the focus. Are we doing the same thing with our homework? Or is it a rush towards the end of the lesson to make sure that they've got the materials for their homework, they've got the date written in when it's expected to be handed in, and then they're packing up and they're going on to the next lesson? Have you shared the intended objectives? And do they understand them? Do the class in front of you understand the objectives to that homework you've just set them? Because if they do, one, they'll approach the homework with a more open mind, so they'll be able to crack on with it. But two, they're more likely to complete it for you. The third one, have you adapted the homework task so that every child, whatever their ability, whatever their educational issues, they can do it? So just as we do with classwork, have we done it with our homework? And that's not just the questions we're setting. It might be the reading materials or the website that we're referring them to. How well do they respond? So doing a bit of a post-mortem afterwards each time that you get a homework in, how well have they done? Whatever I was expecting, did I get it? And did they find it engaging? So is it worth doing a bit of a student voice on your homeworks? Not asking them whether they like homework, but the benefits of, do they understand the purpose? You know, some of the questions that we've just been looking at. What learning gains were achieved? So what can they now do? Or what can they now do more confidently because of the homework? Do you know? Do you know? And then finally, did it successfully extend? Did it successfully consolidate the learning from the lesson? Okay. So those 6 questions, the first one's probably 2 questions in itself, but those questions, put them next to the homework that you've set. Put them next to your curriculum. and think very carefully about what answers you come up with and whether those answers require an action. Because all of these are really about your students feeling a greater understanding of the topic, but understanding why they're doing homework, and if they are, therefore, more likely to complete it. And then we go back to that, okay, it's 5 months progress, but actually, is it? Because if the homework's really good and thoughtful, and that process you've gone through to plan it is as careful as it can be, it might actually be more than 5 months. Or it might be that you can now, like that one Twitter idea was, I can now spend more time looking at the big questions because I know my students are properly doing the smaller questions as part of their homework program that we've put together in geography. So that's the session. I hope it was of use to you. I also hope that you get some practical ideas from it. What I don't want to do is you to go away thinking, I've got lots and lots of work to do on homeworks. We work in very busy environments. The idea is that we have to take into account the needs of our students, the needs of our colleagues, the needs of ourselves with our workload. And we have to make sure that everything we're doing has got a meaning behind it, because then if we've got that meaningful homework and we've got that progress and we've got students completing work, then what a wonderful sort of place that we're in. So again, thank you very much, and hopefully you can take away some ideas from this session.